The meaning of life is to give life meaning. At some point or another, every person wrestles with the same question: why am I here? It's a quiet, persistent uncertainty that lingers beneath everything that we do. Beneath the careers we chase, the people we cling to, even the goals we convince ourselves will make it all feel worthwhile. But whether we choose to acknowledge it or not, the search for purpose is one of the few truly universal human experiences. This question isn't reserved for moments of crisis. It can creep in during the stillness of an ordinary day, when life feels stagnant or directionless. It can haunt the successful just as much as the struggling. You can have everything and still feel like you're grasping at nothing. And that's the thing about meaning. It can't just be bought, won, or given. It must be made. Viktor Frankl once said, "Life is not primarily a quest for pleasure or a quest for power, but instead it is a quest for meaning." So many of us try to fill the void with distraction, with consumption, and with status. But those things are all substitutes. And what we really long for is a reason, a why. And the truth is, meaning doesn't always come with clarity. It doesn't arrive with a sense of ceremony or certainty. More often than not, it's something that we stumble toward in the dark. Many stories throughout anime explore this search for meaning, the drive to find purpose in life. Oftentimes, these stories don't offer easy answers or tidy resolutions. Instead, they reflect something far more relatable: the quiet struggle to feel like you matter, of finding connection, and of rediscovering your worth after it's been shattered. And by the end of this video, hopefully we'll be one step closer to answering the question that lives beneath the surface of us all. How do we find meaning in a world that feels meaningless? In a society where past mistakes often cast long shadows, a silent voice offers a tender yet unflinching exploration of what it means to live with guilt. At its center is Shoya Ishida, a boy once cruel, now hollow, whose life becomes a quiet, desperate search for redemption. Shoya Ishida's story doesn't begin with purpose. It begins with a void, a suffocating silence. Not the silence of peace, but of guilt so heavy it sinks every part of you beneath the surface. In A Silent Voice, the question of meaning isn't answered through some grand ambition or world-changing events. It's a much smaller, more painful question. How do I learn to live with myself? The film doesn't just explore the need for redemption, it explores what happens when a person stops believing that they're even worth redeeming. Shoya's search for purpose is rooted in the unbearable weight of a mistake, a childhood cruelty that spirals out of control. As a young boy, Shoya relentlessly bullied Shoko Nishimiya, a deaf transfer student, in order to impress others, to feel powerful, and to climb the ladder of social approval. He didn't bully her because he hated her. In fact, when watching the movie, you get the sense that he doesn't fully grasp why he's doing it at all. Maybe it's for the laughs, maybe it's for validation, but it wasn't personal, until it became irreversible. Eventually, the class turned on Shoya. He became the scapegoat, the easy target for a group that needs to absolve itself. What began as cruelty turned into karma, and that karma was swift. But this isn't a story about social consequences, it's about internal ones. And after being ostracized, Shoya doesn't just retreat, he collapses inward. He convinces himself that he deserves nothing. No friends, no future, no forgiveness. He grows into a teenager who can't even look others in the eyes, who sees X's covering everyone's face. The world becomes a blur of strangers he feels disconnected from, not just socially or physically, but spiritually. The boy who once shouted to feel powerful can now barely look others in the eye. The message he carries deep within his bones is this: I shouldn't be here. And that kind of belief isn't easily undone. It becomes the architecture of a person's identity. It's not just that he's alone, he believes his loneliness is just. He clings to it like a punishment he must continually accept. Even when he considers taking his own life, it doesn't come from melodrama or despair, but from something colder, more systematic. A belief that he has lived past his usefulness, that his existence is a net negative on the world. But what's extraordinary about Shoya, what makes his arc so resonant and the movie so captivating, is that he doesn't follow through. If he did, then the movie would be 20 minutes long. Something stops him. It's not hope, but rather the unfinished business of the past. Before he ends things, he wants to make one final gesture, an apology to Shoko. That apology becomes a turning point. Not because it absolves him, but because it reopens a door he thought was forever shut. Shoko doesn't hate him, she forgives him. She even wants to be friends. And for someone like Shoya, who has lived in the shadow of self-hatred for years, who hated himself for all the torment that he put Shoko through, that small gesture wasn't just kindness, it was destabilizing. It's proof that maybe the world isn't as final as he thought. But here's the thing, forgiveness doesn't erase guilt. It doesn't make everything better. It doesn't mean Shoya starts loving himself. In fact, it's the opposite. Through the movie, as he begins to reconnect with others, people who originally ostracized him, his internal resistance only grows. He still believes that he doesn't deserve these second chances. He still believes that he's beyond saving. Even when people begin to see him, and the X's on their faces slowly disappear, he struggles to accept their kindness, because in his mind, he hasn't suffered enough to earn it. This is where A Silent Voice becomes brutally honest. It doesn't romanticize redemption, it shows us that healing is not linear, that you can be surrounded by people who care and still feel unworthy of being cared for, that self-forgiveness is sometimes harder than earning the forgiveness of others. Shoya's journey becomes less about fixing the past and more about learning how to live in its aftermath. He rebuilds fragile bridges with his old classmates. He tries to open himself up more, to speak more, to be present. And yet, he remains haunted by the question, why me? Why should I be allowed to move on when Shoko still carries the pain that I caused? This self-doubt is crucial, because even when Shoya begins to act with kindness, he doesn't fully believe his actions matter. He's just trying, moving forward, not out of hope, but out of duty, a kind of moral inertia. And maybe that's what makes the movie so powerful, because he keeps going anyway. That persistence is everything. As Shoya slowly reintegrates into the world, he doesn't suddenly stop feeling guilt. He doesn't suddenly feel whole. But he begins to realize that meaning is something that forms in the spaces between people. His friendship with Shoko, though fragile, becomes a mirror. One that reflects not only the harm that he caused, but the possibility of healing. Their dynamic is never romanticized or made easy. Instead, it's honest, even painful, full of missteps and silences. Yet it is precisely through this struggle that Shoya begins to reconstruct himself. Not as someone who has erased his past, but as someone who is willing to carry it with responsibility and humility. The evolution of his character is subtle but profound. He starts helping others, not to earn approval, but because he's come to understand that empathy is its own kind of salvation. He reaches out to old friends, bridges gaps, and begins to see their struggles as well. In this way, A Silent Voice suggests something deeply philosophical, that we are not redeemed by forgetting what we've done, but by choosing, again and again, to act with care, even when we feel unworthy. There is a pivotal moment at the end of the film, where Shoya stands among a crowd, and for the first time, the X's over everyone's faces vanish. He sees people, truly sees them, and just as importantly, he allows himself to be seen. It is a moment of quiet transcendence. the culmination of years of self-loathing, shame, and gradual healing. It is not the conclusion of his journey, but the beginning of a life no longer lived in hiding. This final scene is not simply symbolic, it is definitive. In choosing to engage with the world again, to open himself up to love, rejection, joy, and pain, Shoya affirms his own existence. He does not erase his past, he owns it. He doesn't receive a tidy resolution, he steps into the unresolved. And in doing so, he claims a truth echoed by philosophers from Kierkegaard to Camus. Meaning is not given. It is chosen, created, and lived, moment by moment, even in the shadow of regret. Shoya Ishida's journey resonates because it reflects something that lies at the core of the human experience: the longing to be forgiven, the desire to matter, and the fear that we never will. His story is a quiet rebellion against despair. In him, we see the terrifying, beautiful reality that our worst mistakes don't have to define us, but confronting them might be the only way to grow. In the end, a silent voice doesn't offer easy redemption. What it offers is more valuable, a vision of life where meaning arises not from perfection, but from persistence, from showing up, from saying I'm sorry, from choosing to love even when you don't know how. Shoya's redemption isn't a reward, it's a process. And his purpose, in the end, is not found in what he achieves, but in how deeply he chooses to live. In a world scarred by war and silence, Violet Evergarden unfolds not as a tale of grand revolution, but as a deeply intimate search for identity. The titular character, a former child soldier turned auto-memory doll, begins her story with no name for her own pain and no language for love. Where others feel and question, Violet follows orders. Her existence, up to this point, has been shaped entirely by violence, obedience, and devotion to her superior officer. She is not burdened by guilt in the way Shoya Ishida is, but rather a haunting emptiness, a void where personhood should be. Her journey is not one of repentance, it is one of discovery, of slowly building a self from the ashes of trauma and war. At the heart of Violet Evergarden lies a single question, one so simple and yet so profound that it reverberates through every episode. What is love? It is the final message Violet receives from Major Gilbert before his disappearance. A phrase she cannot understand but clings to with desperate devotion. The Major's declaration, "I love you," becomes the anchor around which her entire sense of purpose is constructed. But what does it mean to be loved when you do not yet know who you are? When the only thing you've been taught is how to follow commands? In this way, Violet's story mirrors the existential dilemma described by Sartre, that existence precedes essence. She exists undeniably so. She moves, speaks, fights, but she does not yet know why. Her actions, once governed by others, now require intention. Her journey becomes an act of meaning-making, a reconstruction of self not through ideology but through emotional labor and human connection. She becomes an auto-memory doll, writing letters for others, learning to translate emotions she herself has yet to fully experience. In doing so, she begins to engage with the very essence of what it means to be human, to feel, to empathize, to suffer, and to care. Violet's search for meaning is also a search for language, not just in the literal sense of composing letters, but in the deeper, philosophical sense of finding the right words to name what was once unspeakable. In each interaction, with grieving mothers, estranged lovers, or dying children, she begins to feel the emotional textures that once eluded her. These moments, however fleeting, allowed her to begin assembling a sense of self not based on utility or violence, but on shared vulnerability. And in this, Violet Evergarden suggests that meaning is not something we discover in solitude, it is something we create through our openness to others. One of the show's most poignant truths is that Violet doesn't start as broken, she starts as blank. She isn't tormented by guilt like Shoya. Instead, she stands quietly in the center of her own life, asking to be taught how to feel. Her military conditioning has robbed her of emotional fluency, but not of emotional capacity. And as she listens to the pain of others, sometimes tender, sometimes unbearable, her own heart starts to awaken. She learns that love is not just a final word uttered by someone she lost. It is something lived through grief, through kindness, through sacrifice, and through staying. This process of emotional reawakening is not easy. It is marked by relapses into detachment, by nights spent crying alone, by the terror of vulnerability. But as she continues to write letters, she begins to understand something both painful and liberating, that love is inseparable from loss. The very things that make connection meaningful are the same things that make it fragile. In writing the last words for others, she gradually learns how to write the beginning of her own. This is the paradox of her healing. By giving voice to others, she finds her own voice. Her transformation is perhaps most visible in the way she redefines her relationship with Major Gilbert. At the start of the series, he is not just a person, he is a purpose, a singular, all-consuming direction. But as Violet grows, she begins to see him not as a godlike figure to be obeyed, but as a man who once made a choice to love her, even in her most unlovable form. She learns that his love was never conditional upon utility, it was given freely, a human act of compassion, not a transaction. This realization is shattering, and it forces Violet to confront her own potential to feel, to hurt, and to give. In this way, Violet Evergarden suggests a radical truth, that love is not merely an emotion, but a form of meaning itself. It is the thread that binds Violet to the world, not just as a tool or a weapon, but as a person. And in learning to give love, not just receive it, she finally steps into her own story. Not as a soldier, not as a doll, but as Violet, fully human, flawed, and real. And by the end of the series, Violet has not solved herself. She has not erased her past, nor fully escaped her trauma. But she has changed the axis of her life. Where once her existence revolved around command and obedience, now it orbits around empathy and care. Her letters are no longer mechanical transcriptions, they are extensions of her soul. In writing for others, she has begun to rewrite herself. This act of reimagining her own life through the lives of others is where Violet's search for meaning becomes universal. In her, we see the aftermath of emotional numbness, the fear of not knowing who we are without our roles, and the quiet bravery it takes to start over. Her story affirms that identity is not static, but earned, shaped not by grand declarations, but by the ordinary courage to connect, again and again, even when it hurts. In the end, Violet Evergarden is not a story of redemption in the traditional sense, it is a story of emotional resurrection, of a girl born into violence who learned slowly and tenderly how to feel, how to listen, and how to love. This show offers one of the most moving insights of all, that to live fully is to feel deeply, and that in opening ourselves to others, we begin to understand who we are. In a world where silence can be louder than words, March Comes In Like a Lion offers a deeply meditative exploration of what it means to simply exist. Rei Kiriyama, a teenage shogi prodigy, is not driven by guilt like Shoya Ishida, or guided by a question of love like Violet Evergarden. His crisis is quieter, yet just as devastating. He is a young man living without a reason to live, moving through his days like a ghost of his own life. If Shoya is the embodiment of redemption, and Violet a vessel of rediscovering emotion, then Rei is a study in existential vacancy, a person trying to construct meaning where there was once nothing but numbness. Rei doesn't choose shogi. It's not a burning passion or a calling that stirs his soul. It is, rather, the only path left to him after the death of his parents. Taken in by a family who saw in him a vessel for unfulfilled ambition, Rei's life quickly becomes defined not by joy, but by expectation. He plays to survive, not to thrive, and in doing so, he becomes emotionally hollow, alive but not truly living. Every match is a mirror, not just of his skill, but of the emptiness gnawing at his sense of self. Unlike most protagonists in stories about excellence, Rei's question is never, "How do I become the best?" but "Why am I even here?" His conflict isn't with external rivals or obstacles, it's internal, chronic, and often invisible. He grapples with a fundamental detachment from the world, where even his extraordinary talent becomes a burden rather than a gift. His life, though outwardly successful, becomes unmoored, drifting without meaning or destination. In Rei's journey, we find a powerful expression of how being good at something isn't the same as finding purpose in it, and how meaning, if it's to matter, must come from within. His loneliness is not just circumstantial. He lives in a dim apartment, eats alone, studies alone, and even plays alone. The world around him seems painted in grayscale, a visual metaphor for his emotional state. But slowly, a source of light begins to emerge: the Kawamoto sisters. Warm, imperfect, and profoundly human, they don't demand anything from Rei. They don't want him to be exceptional. They simply want him to be. And that, perhaps, is the most radical act of kindness in his life so far. The Kawamoto household becomes kind of a emotional sanctuary, a place where Rei is not a prodigy, not a disappointment, not a symbol of anything, just Rei. In their presence, he begins to feel the contours of something he hadn't known he needed: belonging. Their dinners, their laughter, even their mundane struggles, offer him a vision of life that isn't centered around performance. Yet, this path is far from linear. Rei continues to battle depression, self-doubt, and the ever-looming specter of emotional relapse. He questions whether he even deserves the kindness he's shown. He wonders if his presence burdens others. The show never romanticizes his struggle, and it never offers quick fixes. Instead, it invites us to sit with Rei in his discomfort, to witness the slow, painful process of learning to believe that you are allowed to take up space in the world. Shogi too begins to change in meaning for him. It shifts from being a lifeline of obligation to a mirror of self-understanding. The strategies, the patience, the discipline, they become metaphors for his emotional journey. In learning to play shogi with presence rather than avoidance, Rei starts to reclaim his agency. He no longer plays simply because he must, but because he begins to see it as a language, a way to express himself, a way to connect. The game that once symbolized his isolation now becomes a medium for growth. What's remarkable about Rei's journey is how grounded it remains in small victories. There are no sweeping epiphanies, no sudden declarations of purpose. Instead, meaning builds slowly, imperceptibly, through morning routines, shared meals, difficult conversations, and the simple act of waking up one more day. It is this humility that gives the story its emotional resonance. Rei is not becoming a hero, he is becoming a person. At its core, March Comes In Like a Lion is a gentle confrontation with the fear that life might be inherently meaningless. But instead of offering platitudes or easy answers, it suggests that meaning is not something found, it is built, piece by piece, through engagement with the world. Rei doesn't arrive at purpose like a revelation, he uncovers it through persistence, through kindness, through choosing to stay when it would be easier to run. By the later arcs of the story, Rei is no longer just surviving. He is participating in his own life, in the lives of others, in the quiet symphony of being alive. He still wrestles with darkness, but now he has touchstones of light. The Kawamoto sisters, his mentor, fellow shogi players, even his rivals. They do not complete him, but they remind him that he isn't alone. And perhaps that is the heart of Rei's journey. Not triumph, not mastery, not even peace, but presence. The realization that being here, with all your doubts and scars, is enough of a reason to keep going. That you don't need to justify your existence through achievement. That you can learn slowly how to be human, and that the learning itself can be meaningful. And in that, March comes in like a lion, reminds us that the search for meaning doesn't always look like a quest. It often looks like staying, breathing, caring, and trying again tomorrow.